Hello, everyone, and welcome to Good Ethical Morning, the podcast where we review ethics and share morals. In today's episode, you're joined by your hosts, Raphael Twassen and
Anisha Reddy.
As we discuss the dark history of Canadian Indigenous residential schools.
Not only will we provide our own personal opinion and morals on the issue, but we will also be deconstructing an article titled Canada's Residential Schools Were a Horror, brought to you by today's sponsor and our great friends over at Scientific American.
The article was published on August 1st, 2021 by author Ian Mosby, who me and Anish are great fans of. His work is super creative and we suggest you go check him out on the official Scientific American website.
With that being said, we have a lot in store for you guys today, so sit back and enjoy, grab a snack, and let's dive right in. Recently, people have been throwing around the phrase residential schools, but what does that actually mean?
Residential schools were institutions that were sponsored by the government and ran by churches, with the sole purpose of educating and converting Indigenous youth into Canadian society.
Wow, that sounds cruel.
Cruel is just an understatement. In these schools, nearly 150,000 children were admitted, and about 6,000 of them died to many different forms of abuse and countless diseases.
That's terrible. It gets even worse when you learn about how long of a period these schools were up and running, as well as how recently the last school finally closed for good.
I know. It hasn't even been 30 years since the last school closed down. The issue of residential schools in Canada continues to haunt the Indigenous community, as recent discoveries in the news suggest that there is more justice and reconciliation that the Indigenous peoples deserve.
I even heard that the discovery of unmarked graves is currently trending in the news, which shows the everlasting effect that this event has caused even to this day.
With that being said, let's dive right into the article, as I feel like it raises some great points and has a ton of revealing information.
The article that we're going to discuss is Canada's Residential Schools Were a Horror by Ian Mosby. Thanks again to Scientific American for providing us with this great article. First and foremost, what do you think the thesis of the article was, Raf?
I thought that it was an implicit statement, along the lines of the residential school system in Canada was a horrific and traumatic experience that has had and continues to have negative effects on Indigenous people and their culture.
I think that's a good choice. I also felt that the thesis was implicit, as there was no concrete sentence in the article that covered every idea brought up by Ian Mosby.
That's very true. How do you think he helped support the thesis, though?
The author uses some great examples of methods of proof, such as verifiable facts and references to authority figures.
Really? How so?
Well, first off, Mosby includes a fact that talks about the alarming number of graves that has been recently dug up, as well as the total number of unmarked graves.
Yeah, I agree. By including this verifiable fact in the essay, it really helps Mosby support his thesis, as well as further prove the horrors of the residential school system.
Something else that really stood out to me was stating that the recently identified graves are only a small fraction of the actual number of victims. This quote also highlights the severity of the issue and how it continues to affect the Indigenous culture to this day.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Another method of proof that I believe to be quite effective was referencing Peter Bryce and his works.
Wait a minute, who is that again?
Peter Bryce is an Indian Affairs Chief Medical Officer, as well as a well-respected physician, known for his work and opinions towards residential schools. This statement from him is extremely disturbing, as it shows the sheer amount of death that was caused by these schools.
I also believe that the percentages he mentions gets even more horrific after learning about just how many children were caught into the grip of the system.
Yeah, that's very true. I definitely agree that including these methods of proof in the article strengthens an author's opinion. What a convincing article. That makes me wonder, what rhetorical devices do you think he also used?
He used devices such as position and parallelism, which really enhanced his flow and brought out a fuller meaning in his text. He used position in the article by including dashes while talking about how much lower the funding is towards Indigenous hospitals and sanatoria compared to other buildings. On top of this, the quote talks about how unfair it is that healthcare provided to the Indigenous is substandard. The use of position highlights the poor hospital conditions that the Indigenous people had to endure strictly due to their background. The Indigenous community has been suffocated by the actions of residential schools for nearly 200 years, to the point where they were not even able to receive fair human rights such as shelter and healthcare.
That's a great point.
As for the other rhetorical device in the article, when the author talks about what children attending residential schools had to go through, I saw this as an example of parallelism, as the author creates a sense of repetition and brings significance to each sentence. This highlights just a few of the many gruesome activities that the residential schools forced upon the children trapped in the system. Each sentence that Mosby writes holds a lot of meaning, and I was able to sympathize with the victims who had to experience those tasks.
Man, this article is honestly so sad. I can't even imagine what those schools were like. I was gonna ask if there were any figures of speech in the article, but now that I'm thinking about it, there probably is none.
Well, Raf, although this article is written about a very serious topic, I did manage to find 2 examples.
Really? What were they?
I felt like the imagery in the article really reached me, and I was able to understand just how poor the living conditions were. It gave me a small idea of how it was to be a part of the residential school system, as well as emphasized the tragic and disturbing aftermath of it. The imagery also gave me a glimpse of the tragic lives of the victims, as they were treated inhumanely and were shown no signs of sympathy.
Yeah, that part really got to me.
Another thing that I noticed was that it was quite ironic when the article talked about the defenders of the residential schools. They used the argument that the school provided the children with education and good health care. I thought that this was ironic, as in reality, the exact opposite happened. This use of irony showed just how poor the execution of the school system was.
That example really showed how sometimes the action can significantly overshadow the intentions, especially in the case of something so negative such as residential schools.
That's very true. I also think that the tone of the article helped establish the author's opinion towards the whole topic.
Exactly. The grim and dark tone of the essay created a very serious and saddening mood. The grim aspects of the article comes from the author writing about all the events that took place at the schools.
And with that, deconstruction is complete. However, before we continue, we have a quick word from our sponsors.
Today's episode is sponsored by Scientific American, the best science magazine for real-world issues and stories, just like the article deconstructed in today's episode. Have you ever felt left out with today's news or felt unaware of the events occurring around the world? Well, look no further. If you're looking to be more informed on today's trending topics, use code GOODEthicalMorning to receive a 15% discount when subscribing for the first time. Make sure you claim this offer before March 31st, 2023 on the official website scientificamerican.com to benefit from this one-time deal. Welcome back from our commercial break. Now it's time for discussion. Me and Anish will take turns talking about our opinions on residential school history in Canada and see whether or not we agree with each other. With that being said, why don't you start us off, Anish?
I know this may sound a bit crazy, but I kind of see what people like Egerton Ryerson were trying to do with the whole residential school system. I was doing some reading on this topic a couple of days ago, and I stumbled upon an article written by Tristan Hopper from the National Post. Initially, the schools were meant to provide for the First Nation community with a solid education as well as better health care. Ryerson was never actually anti-Indigenous, and he even spoke their language. He was also good friends with a lot of people from that community, so there's no way he wished for anything bad to happen to them, right?
Hold on, wait a second. Are you saying what I think you're saying? There's no way you're even justifying a single bit of what these people have done, or the amount of pain they have caused.
I mean, they were only doing all of that with good intentions in their head. All they wanted to do was help the Indigenous people and allow them to thrive and be successful in, as they called it, a white society. All they really wanted to do was give the Indigenous people an equal opportunity as well as a strong education to go forward in life. If anything, by allowing the First Nations to be a part of their economy and society, they should have been thankful for the works of Ryerson and Scott.
Well, Anish, that sure is a crazy opinion. I'm really surprised that you actually believe any of that nonsense. I'm not too sure what kind of news you've been reading lately, but I suggest you take a look at this article I saw this morning, actually. It was published by The Varsity, which is the University of Toronto's student newspaper since 1880.
Oh wow, I've read some of their articles before. Their content is definitely informative and well written. Maybe I'll take a look at it.
I really hope you find the time to. As the author of this article, Sharice Mohammed Ali, stated a really bold opinion of hers that I 100% agree with.
What is it?
She believes that the Canadian government must take responsibility for residential schools. If I'm going to be honest here, I don't see why anyone would even disagree with her. She mentions that despite Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau being critical towards the country's quote-unquote historical treatment of Indigenous children, it cannot change the fact that the Canadian government and individuals such as Egerton Ryerson and Duncan Campbell Scott are complicit in the death of these poor children.
This may be a little bit correct, but I feel like some people are being too harsh towards Ryerson and Scott. They both just wanted to do what's best for everyone, and in order for that to happen, the addition of residential schools was necessary. By teaching the indigenous children about the Catholic religion, it allowed them to pursue a moral and practical education, which is something that Ryerson, as well as Scott, were strong believers in.
I mean, despite that, Ryerson and Scott definitely knew about the consequences of their actions, and they still decided to go on with their evil plan.
Wow, I never really thought of it like that. I guess it could be true that their tunnel vision mindset of providing a good education to the First Nation children blinded them and even prevented them from seeing the stuff they were actually doing.
Just wait until you hear about this. What really hit home about the article was when the author stated how the discovery of the remains should not even come to a surprise to anyone. The fact that this is now the harsh reality of Canada's history towards the Indigenous is flat out disturbing. Also, the way that the Canadian government has manipulated and lied to the Indigenous community is just so heartbreaking to me.
What do you mean by manipulated?
Well, an example could be the Indian Act, tied back to the year of 1876, when the Indigenous were told that they were going to keep their freedom, their land, and culture. Instead of this, they were stripped of their rights in the treaty and would even be punished if they were to practice their own beliefs.
Oh my god, I can't believe I didn't know any of this. This is so cruel.
The worst part is that it doesn't even stop at that point. These treaties and acts of assimilation towards the Indigenous have injected major intergenerational trauma into the lives of their communities that can be felt even today.
Other than the horrific latest discoveries of the unmarked graves, what else is there?
Well, it is the fact that those who come from residential schools forever have to live with the struggles they faced with in their youth. Upon returning to their homes, many survivors struggle to cope with their pain, so they rely on drugs and alcohol to ease their suffering. Battling with depression and anxiety has resulted into the high rates of suicide that are present within Indigenous communities, which is why spreading awareness is just so important. They deserve to have the same resources and opportunities that other Canadians have access to.
Well, at least the government has apologized for these actions, right?
I mean, they did apologize. However, it held little to no weight, as they failed to apologize at the right time. People like Edgerton Ryerson and Duncan Campbell Scott have dealt damage beyond repair. And with a government that continuously avoids taking responsibility for their action, this all makes the entire situation even worse.
I think I'm starting to understand your point much better now, and I disagree with Ryerson and Scott's ideas and beliefs.
Hey man, I'm just glad I didn't have to come fight you over this.
Phew, that got heated real fast.
Yeah, I sure did.
I'm glad we were able to bring this topic to the podcast today. I'm sure a lot of people at home learned something new.
They definitely did, because to be honest, I didn't even know half the things we talked about before this episode.
Same here, Ralph. That really opened my eyes to such a terrible aspect of our nation's history.
Residential schools continue to haunt the lives of many Indigenous people, and it is important that Good Ethical Morning and its community advocates and fights for justice.
Because of this, we have decided that for every like on today's episode, we will be donating $5 each to Indigenous communities around the world. Thank you once again to the Scientific American for sponsoring this episode, as well as Ian Mosby for allowing us to deconstruct his article, as well as shed some light on this topic.
Here at Good Ethical Morning, we recognize the tragedy and horror that residential schools brought to the Indigenous community, and we believe that it is never too late to leave an impact and fight for justice.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Good Ethical Morning podcast, and we hope to see you in the next one.
Next episode, we will be discussing global warming and the impact of greenhouse gas emissions in the environment.
And as always, don't forget to leave a thumbs up on our page, as well as click the notification bell to get notified when new episodes come out every Friday. Have a great day, and remember to stay ethical.